to the poor. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, Why do you bother women? Why do you bother the woman? She has done a good deed for me. For the poor you have with you always, but you do not always have me. For when she poured this perfume upon my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done shall also be spoken in memory of her.
I think they're probably both the same account. I mean, the thing that throws us a little bit is I think we assume it's at Lazarus' house in John 12. Never says that. So Matthew and Mark are a little more specific in the location in Bethany, which is where Lazarus and Martha were from. And then the other thing that I think throws us a little bit might be Mark 14 makes the statement that it's 2 days until the Passover, whereas John is pretty explicit about it being 6 days. But Mark says 2 days before the Passover, the beginning of 14, but then in verse 3 where he starts this account, he just says, and while he was at Bethany. So it doesn't necessarily follow that what happened at Bethany that Mark is relaying in verses 3 through 9 was 2 days from the Passover. So, I mean, there are a couple assumptions we make.
And for people here, it probably does not need to be on. And maybe some of the people, if we have them at home, maybe you don't need that either, because I am pretty loud at times. So you know that this going from John over here to Matthew and Mark sometimes can be kind of confusing when you're taking a look at the two accounts, and can sometimes, you know, I don't know, throw up questions about that. So again, you know, what kind of perfume or ointment do we have here? it's costly. And I think, like Chuck said, it kind of, you know, what is someone doing with that costly of a perfume? Mainly the people that Jesus hung out with, that followed Jesus. They were not wealthy by any means. But this was, this was something for a special occasion, and Jesus certainly was someone special, and that's certainly indicated here, because the person, which from John we find was Mary, was willing to use that. And not, did she just dab a little bit on him? She poured the whole thing out, right? You know, sometimes when we have something that's costly, and I'm going to rat on Debbie a little bit, but because when we first got married, we couldn't afford a whole lot. So when she got some perfume, buddy, she made the costly stuff, she made it last, and she only put a little bit on during special occasions and stuff. So, she wanted it to last. Here, that she used the whole thing on Jesus. What else? Again, we find here in Matthew's account. What do we find? Who was indignant with the perfume being used that was costly?
His disciples.
It was the disciples. In Matthew's account, anyway, it says that, and when his disciples had saw it, they had indignation. What was the purpose of this waste? And so, in John's account, he singled out Judas. However, with Matthew, when he says that his disciples saw it, does it mean every single disciple was indignant? Or could it just be, several of them?
I don't think it needs to include all of them.
But evidently, Matthew was probably one of them that was indignant from this as well. Because a lot of times when we're with a group of people and somebody comes out and says, why was this not sold for something else? Then other people tend to think, yeah, why wasn't this? And so that kind of stirs things up and gets people going. And maybe it was Judas, because John's account says Judas come out and said this. Maybe John was not influenced by the things that Judas had said. Maybe some of the other disciples, though, were. And so one of the things that we need to understand, and as we grow older, is not to let other people push our buttons. Because there are certainly some people that are out there to cause division, that are out there and maybe Judas wasn't necessarily wanting to cause division. He just basically said something. But we need to, before we confirm or deny or take a stance, we need to know what that stance would be. And so with that, and as we studied in John, what does Jesus come back to say with that? Right. And it's this account that John brought out Sunday, is that Jesus also talked about this woman, that this would be a memorial of her, that she had anointed him, basically for his burial. All right, so let's take a look at any comments on it, Terry.
Joe, you got a comment?
I just had, I was looking up this oil that she poured on him. And it says that was more than 300 denarii, and said that's a day's wages. So in today's wages in the United States, it would have been worth $12,000 worth of perfume that she poured on Jesus.
A day's wages is $12,000?
$12,000 in American money today. Yeah.
A day's wages? Yeah. Oh, okay, okay. All right, all right. So it's close to a year's worth of wages. Okay. It must be the mask. I'm not hearing too well. You're not as loud as what you used to be, Terry. Any other comments before we head to the questions? Okay, so question number 5, whose house and what city is Jesus in? What house?
Simon the leper.
In Bethany. Good job. Okay, what happens while Jesus is sitting at the table, and who's responsible for doing this thing? Okay, a woman pours expensive oil on him. Again, we're going through the question and throwing answers in case you want to write these things down. That way, the more that we kind of, when you write it, when you talk it, when you repeat it a couple times, you remember it much better. Okay, what is the complaint of the disciples? They thought it was wasteful, didn't they, Audrey? So what was Jesus' response to those disciples?
They said that it could have been sold and given to the poor. Well, Jesus said, you have the poor with you all the time. You only have me for a little while.
Right. And so when we took a look at John's statement on that, and he calls out Judas, and maybe the rest of the disciples that were indignant, they genuinely thought, yes, this could have been given to the poor. But was that the case with Judas? What was his thoughts? Huh? What was his thought?
That this was a waste that needed to be given to the poor.
But really, was he concerned about the poor?
No, he wasn't.
What was that 300?
He was quite often pilfering the box that he carried. He was the treasurer,
Yeah.
and he pilfered the thing quite often.
So he might not have taken the whole 300 denarii, but there would be some of that put in his pocket.
Leaked into his pocket.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot to get that out. How'd that get in there?
It's a holding charge.
There you go. So, again, like I said, when we take a look at the disciples, the disciples that really did, maybe if Judas was the one that said that, and maybe some of the other disciples was indignant because of that, I'm sure the disciples their concern was really the poor. And again, Jesus, he was not downplaying the poor, saying that he's saying the opportunity to do something for me is very limited. And how many days here at Simon's house are we to the Passover? 2. So, we talked about 6 when he came into Bethany. It's 2 days before the Passover here. So, I mean, it's very close, very close. So, the opportunity's not going to be around much longer. Okay, any other comments before we move on? John?
I really don't know if this is the only place that talks about it, but that, when we think about Jesus and for these 3 years he's with the disciples, at least for me, I don't visualize them with a money box, and yet they had one. And here Jesus is, and he has the power to feed people 5,000 at a pop and then some. Well, what does Jesus need a money box for? Well, he doesn't necessarily need it, but they had it. This was how he chose to do things. And sometimes that just doesn't, perhaps our, I just don't imagine it. And then you read it and it's like, yeah, it's there. They had a money box, and that's, it's part of it. This is how he was doing things.
So, let me throw a question out there. Yes, Jesus has fed multitudes of people, but was that his purpose to do that? When do we find him feeding the multitudes of people?
After he'd been teaching them all day and they were hungry, and it turns out to be, I think, more of a lesson for the disciples than anything. But
And so, why did Jesus do the miracles? What was the purpose of the miracles that he did?
confirming the message.
Confirm the message. So, to simply produce a meal because they're hungry, I think that might have been an abuse of what his powers were for. When he sent the disciples out 2 by 2, what did he tell them to do?
The first time when they go they just go among Israel, he tells them not to take anything. But then the second time he says, remember when you didn't take anything? They said, yeah. And he said, everything turned out okay. But now I'm telling you, you better prepare yourself. And he tells them to take money, have money sack, and things like that.
Right. So they had to have money somehow to live. Some of the disciples had families. I mean, we know Peter had a wife and mother-in-law and stuff. I mean, there were still needs that had to be met. And it wasn't there for Jesus just to bring things into existence. John or Jim?
One of the miracles that Jesus performed in feeding, I don't know, it was the 5,000 or the 4,000. But when he asked the disciples, did they have enough bread or things like this, he knew what he was going to do ahead of time. But he was doing this to create a realm of faith in these individuals, trying to get them, understand, see, because later he says, whenever they said, well, we don't do we not have any bread, and he said, don't you understand what I fed all these people before, and these remnants left over? So it was a faith building exercise to why he did it. I'm sure he didn't do that every breakfast, every lunch, every dinner, etc.
Go ahead, Audrey.
It says he had compassion on them. I mean,
Yes.
he cared about them. He knew their situation, so he cared. And he did this, I'm sure partly because of the fact that he realized that they were hungry and that they needed something to eat. And as John has said, they'd been there for a period of time, but he did have compassion on them. That's our Savior.
And I'm sure the crowd that when they went there, I mean, they didn't go prepared. They didn't bring a picnic lunch or nothing like that. There were some people that did bring some food, but not very many. It's kind of like when you go out west or something and you're going between Las Vegas and Bakersfield, California. You better have a full tank when you leave, because there's not much of anything for a gas station if you don't have any water with you on long trips. You get stuck in a traffic jam for a couple hours, you could be very thirsty after that. So it's always wise to be prepared. But when we take a look at what the disciples did, Jesus expected the people that they talked with, the people that they taught, to house them, to feed them. And I'm sure that there were those who gave donations to them to be able to do the work as well. John?
I guess I brought it up just because I think sometimes unbelievers, when they, they consider the church taking up the collection or the fact that we have a treasury, and they think, oh, that's just greedy. Well, they had a treasury box, and it wasn't greedy. It was how the Lord decided to do things, and that's not greedy. That's how they did it.
And we do find, in the scriptures where money was used. Even in the Old Testament, how did the Levites live?
By all the other tribes, funds went into, again, supporting the Levite tribe.
Because they had no territory, they had no land of their own, and so their whole job was to do God's business, to take care of the spiritual aspect of the nation. And so the other tribes were expected to take care. What happened with all the sacrificed animals? Didn't the Levites get some of those to provide for their meals and stuff? And so we always find that the work of God takes care of those folks somehow. The Levites, it was the other tribes that were expected. Here it's for the followers to help those who are out teaching. John isn't coming here to preach for free. He has to live. He has a family that he has to feed, and so we provide that. Elders, if they're doing a work here that requires them to not have a job or otherwise, if it's that much, they could be paid. And so those doing God's overseeing God's work and doing God's work, they have the same rights as an ox out in the field. Was a farmer supposed to muzzle the ox? Why?
Ox, it's not going to be strong enough to do the work.
But why was the ox not? I know it wouldn't, but why? Yeah, when it's out there in the field, if it's hungry, it'll reach down, eat some of the grain, eat some of that. It's working, and so it is due some of the fruit of the labor. And it's the same thing when the disciples went out to teach. It's the same thing here when Christ and them are going out. It's the fruit of the labor that they're doing for God. And again, we don't see anything where people were giving them money, but we do find in the New Testament how the church is to collect on the first day of the week. We can see in special circumstances that there's great needs, that people can sell things that they have and come. Here it was at the apostles' feet. If it was something here at the church that some families needed help or something like that, we could bring it to the elders, and they could help with that as well. And we find, why was there 7 chosen to wait on tables? Because there was a need to feed widows. And they were widows indeed because they had no husband or no children to feed them. And so how were they going to live? And so, again, when we talk about the treasury, the box that the disciples had, they still had to live. They still had to eat. They still had to do whatever. And again, if Jesus was providing everything miraculously, what would that teach the disciples? There you go. And there's nothing free, is there? Okay, I talk too much. I don't like that. So, is there any other comments before we move on? But good discussions, good questions. Okay, so we're taking a look now at the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. If someone would get one of those 3 passages or 4 passages and read that, raise your hand and Chuck it come with the microphone.
I'll read from Luke 19, beginning in verse 29. When he drew near to Bethphage and Bethany at the mount that is called Olivet, he sent 2 of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village beyond you, where on entering you will find a colt tied, on which no one has ever yet sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you untying it, you shall say this: the Lord has need of it." So those who were sent away found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owners said to them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And he said, "The Lord has need of it." Along, they spread their clothes on the road. As he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all of the mighty works that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees and the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." And he answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, very stones would cry out." And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time."
Okay, so where are we leaving from and where are we going to? Okay, so we're leaving Bethany, we're going into Jerusalem, so Jesus isn't going to walk. So what does he tell them to do? And what kind of a colt was this? And it's not, was it a thoroughbred horse, or we know it was a young donkey, but what nobody has ever sat on it. Nobody. I watch a lot of Westerns. And Jesus is going to sit on an animal that nobody has ever sat on. What would you expect that animal to do? Buck. He doesn't want all that on him. But do we see that happening? No, we don't. So, again, Jesus tells them what about the colt? And I know that's kind of an open-ended question. Where do they go to get one? He tells them where you find it, right? Absolutely. So, where to find it? It'll be tied up. Untie it. Bring it if someone asks why you're taking my colt. Because in the Westerns, that's a hanging fence right there. You don't steal nobody's horse. Chuck?
Stealing somebody's car. I mean, that's their transportation.
But apparently, the person with the colt knew who the Lord was, who they were talking about, don't you think? Because, I mean, would you, if somebody come up and said, got in your car and was starting your car up, and you said, hey, where you going with my car? "Ah, a friend of mine needs it." Are you, what? So I would assume that this guy probably knows who the Lord is. I mean, he doesn't say, I mean, maybe he said Jesus, but here we find it's the Lord needs it. And so he lets him have the colt. Again, I find it, a lot of people may take a look that, okay, the Lord gets on the colt, but don't you think there was something more to it when he says that nobody has ever ridden it? Does that have any meaning at all? Again, if
Colt is pure as far as any exposure to someone using it. So it was reserved to be used by the Lord. It was not spoiled in any way.
right, that's certainly a spiritual application. I'm purely looking at it from a physical thing that the Lord gets on this donkey, and I mean, he rides it. I mean, nothing. I mean, like I said, you get on a horse or on an animal that nobody's been on their back. They really, when the cloaks went on the donkey's back, that mule probably wouldn't have liked that. That donkey would not have liked that at all either. So, but I think Jim's right. This colt was specifically for the Lord. And therefore, I mean, it didn't buck. It didn't keep Christ from getting on him and riding him. So
I wonder if the owner of that colt knew about Zechariah 9:9, knew what it said, and thought, this is happening to me. I'm involved in this prophecy that I've forgotten his name, Zechariah made.
right. So I mean, it is a prophecy that is fulfilled in this, and so basically he told the disciples that, and so we find that. So what happens as he's riding in?
It's kind of what we would today think the red carpet treatment. They putting down their coats and putting down palm branches in front of them to lead them into Jerusalem.
What other relative of Christ did something like this? And I know you're probably saying, what in the world is that question? How about David when he came in, riding in, and Saul? What did Saul think when they were saying that Saul killed his thousands and David killed his 10,000s? Wasn't too happy about that, was he? Really jealous of David. And so here we see Christ riding in, and the people are all shouting and making a big whoop-de-doo with Christ coming in, and they were shouting, and what were some of the things that they were saying? I think they had
It's really
something.
got the fair. Blessed the king. Blessed is the king. You know.
Right. And so they're relating him as the king. And so here, again, Jesus has what's we've called the triumphant entrance into Jerusalem. I mean, it's like a big parade. People are crowding around. Again, there's a lot of jealousy then. Who's jealous of all that? And what did they, who was it and what did they say to Jesus? So what type of Jews were talking? And so what did the Pharisees tell Jesus to do? Rebuke them. Get after them for saying those things. And so what did Jesus say back to them about that? Huh? Right, there wasn't anything to rebuke, but what did Jesus tell them about that though? Besides, really, there's nothing wrong with them saying what they're saying.
I think that's what he was saying. He told them, he said, well, the stones could cry this out. I mean, he just kind of pointed out, it is what it is. It's right. It's not, he wasn't.
Yeah, with him saying, I literally think that the rocks would have been shouting things out. I mean, we've seen some of the prophets, some of the stories where inanimate objects actually talking and doing things. But there was no need for that to happen here because the disciples was doing that. But with Christ coming in, if they were to be quiet, there would be shouting anyway. Do you have something? He's going.
So this is not just transportation. This is a king who's coming in for salvation. And when you read Zechariah, some of the symbolism I'm not going to necessarily put together, but one thing that stands out to me, and I don't remember when I figured this out or who told me this, he talks about a day declaring a restoration double to you in verse 12 of Zechariah. Verse 13 says, I will bend Judah as my bow, and I will fill the bow with Ephraim. And I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece. Ephraim and Judah were the northern and southern kingdoms. When this was written, they were never reunited physically. And here was the king who was coming in not on a war stallion. He wasn't even on a war donkey. He was on a baby donkey. And so he was reuniting the north and the south of Israel. And that wasn't a manifestation of a reestablishment of David's throne in a physical way. But this whole entry is to say, here was the great uniter who was bringing together all of God's people from all generations and from all nations. And so this king was using methods of peaceful entry, non-threatening warrior style to bring in peace and salvation for the north and the south, and the east and the west. It doesn't say that because there was no east, East Israel and West Israel. But the point is, it's God through His Son reuniting all peoples under one king for the first and last time since at least David.
Absolutely. And you're right, that was not a war donkey. And really, as far as when you take a look at kings, would a king be riding into town on a donkey? Unlikely. But Jesus, it shows his humility, but as well as with his authority. But it shows that he does have humility. John?
To look at the parallel accounts, it is just amazing that Jesus is doing what he's doing, because, like he said, blessed is he who comes in the name of, they're recognizing him. It's like, this is the time, this is the coronation, this is the event. Let me go get your stallion for you. No, I don't want a stallion. It's a fulfillment of prophecy, and we're coming lowly. And the Zechariah prophecy, the very next verse after the one that talks about the lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt the foal of a donkey, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem. And it is amazing, and I appreciated what you just said about his humility, but also his authority. Because, yes, he is king. And it amazes me in Mark's account, as he's riding in and, not counting those who were cursing him, the Pharisees. He comes in at this time, and it says in Mark's account at chapter 11, verse 11, and Jesus went into Jerusalem and into the temple, and when he had looked around at all these things, as the hour was already late, he went out to Bethany. He goes into the temple and he looks around. He's going to come back in the following day and cleanse the temple again for the second time. And I mean, it just amazes me as all the people are applauding him and praising him. He has a job to do, and he's coming in to do it.
So, as going into the temple, and I know it's kind of part of the questions and stuff, but why would Jesus want to go to the temple? I mean, he's come into town. A lot of people, well, we'll save that for Sunday morning. So think about that. We'll finish up this portion, and hopefully we'll get done with 38 and start into 39. I think the questions for 39 are back there if you don't have them. Thank you so much for the comments. Thank you for participating in class. We learn a lot more when everybody talks and we can hear different things.